This video is brought to you by Henson Shaving. On Wednesday, a federal court ruled that Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, as well as any other tariffs Trump's imposed via the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, were unlawful, giving the administration just 10 days to wind them down. While the Trump administration have since said they'll appeal, as it stands, the ruling threatens to throw an enormous spanner into not just Trump's trade policy, but his political project more broadly. So in this video, we thought we'd explain what the ruling actually said, and what might happen next. Never miss an episode, and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So to understand this ruling, you need a bit of context. According to the Constitution, it's Congress, not the President, that has the authority to impose tariffs. This follows from Article 1, Section 8, which states that the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. However, over time, Congress has delegated more and more of its constitutional powers to the President and executive branch, especially with regard to tariff setting. According to the Congressional Research Service, today there were at least 6 laws that grant the President and the executive the ability to set tariffs without congressional approval. For most of his pre-Liberation Day tariffs, Trump used 3 of these provisions, namely Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act and Sections 201 and 301 of the 1974 Trade Act. In his first term, for instance, Trump used Section 232, which says the President can impose tariffs on national security grounds, if recommended by the Secretary of Commerce. To impose tariffs on steel and aluminium, Section 232 tariffs were then expanded earlier this year, with higher rates on steel and aluminium, and the inclusion of additional products such as automobiles and auto parts. In his first term, Trump also used Section 201, which says the President can impose trade barriers on goods entering the US that, quote, injure or threaten to injure domestic industries, to impose tariffs on Chinese solar panels and washing machines, which are still in place. Then, earlier this year, Trump used Section 301, which says the President can impose tariffs on any foreign government that, quote, violates an international trade agreement or is unjustified, unreasonable, or discriminatory, to impose new tariffs on China. Section 301 was actually first used by the Biden administration in late 2024, when they used it to impose tariffs on a number of nominally strategic goods like electric vehicles and medical equipment. Now, all of these tariffs were legally defensible. After all, you can make a pretty plausible argument that the US needs to protect its aluminium and steel industries on national security grounds. Equally, you can make a pretty plausible argument that Chinese trade practices are discriminatory, in some sense, and that they threaten to, quote, injure American companies. However, Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, which were threatened against basically all of America's trading partners and calculated using some very questionable maths, were on shakier legal grounds. After all, it's harder to argue that all of America's trading partners are engaged in unfair trade practices, or that trade with these countries represents a threat to America's national security. This is why, to impose these tariffs, Trump used a new bit of legislation, the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEEPA, which allows the President to impose wide-ranging trade restrictions following a presidential declaration of a national emergency. Trump had previously used this same law to impose tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada, apparently in response to the unacceptable flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants into the US. For the Liberation Day tariffs, Trump and White House officials argued that America's trade deficit constituted a national emergency, and justified his tariffs on America's trading partners by pointing to America's bilateral trade deficits. But, well, this argument was always less than watertight. After all, it's not clear that both America's fentanyl crisis and its trade deficit constitute national emergencies, given that the IEEPA defines national emergencies as unusual and extraordinary threats from outside the United States, and neither trade deficits nor drug crises are necessarily unusual or extraordinary. Even if you do think they constitute national emergencies, it's not clear this gives Trump unlimited tariff-setting power. Again, the IEEPA states that tariffs may, quote, only be exercised to deal with a national emergency and may not be exercised for any other purpose. It's not clear how Trump's particular tariffs deal with either problem, given that, well, tariffs don't really have a direct impact on illegal drug flows. And there's a pretty widespread academic consensus that they're not a good way of remedying a trade deficit. This is why, almost immediately after Liberation Day, the nonpartisan Liberty Justice Centre filed a lawsuit against the relevant executive order on behalf of 5 small businesses that import goods affected by the tariffs, which was then followed by more lawsuits from 12 Democrat-led states. This all came to a head on Wednesday, when a panel of 3 judges at the US Court of International Trade in Manhattan issued a unanimous ruling declaring that Trump's use of IEEPA was unlawful and ordering him to wind down the global 10% tariff, elevated rates on China, and the fentanyl-related tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico. In their ruling, the court essentially argued that while drug trafficking might amount to a national emergency, the tariffs imposed don't actually, quote, deal with that emergency, as is required by the IEEPA, and that Trump's claim to unlimited tariff-setting powers to deal with a trade deficit is not warranted by the IEEPA. The court gave the administration 10 days to effectuate its order, but this might be voided if an appeals court allows Trump to reinstate them during litigation. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well with the Trump administration. White House spokesperson Kush Desai claimed, quote, "It's not for unelected judges to decide how to properly address a national emergency," and the Justice Department immediately issued a notice of appeal. So, what happens next? Well, for what it's worth, we think there's a good chance this ruling ultimately gets reversed, especially if it ends up in the Supreme Court, given the court has generally ruled in Trump's favour when it comes to questions of executive authority. But if it's upheld, this will be pretty terrible news for Trump. For starters, businesses who've had to pay tariffs will have to be refunded, with interest. But more significantly, without the threat of tariffs, Trump will struggle to push America's trading partners around in the way he apparently hopes to. There are other ways that Trump could impose sanctions. For instance, the court recommended using Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, which allows the president to impose 15% tariffs in response to persistent and large trade imbalances. But this isn't the unlimited tariff-setting power Trump intends, and any Section 122 tariffs would have to be reviewed by Congress after 150 days. Trump might be able to bow Congress into submission, but the current Republican disquiet at his one big beautiful bill suggests they're not quite as scared of Trump as they used to be. Lots of people actively don't like shaving. It's getting increasingly expensive, with brands selling overpriced razor cartridges stuffed with useless technology. And even if you do pay for all of it, you're often still left with a bad shave, razor burn, ingrown hairs, and irritation. That's a problem that Henson aimed to solve with their razor. So, in typical TLDR style, let me explain why Henson's razors are better for 3 reasons. Firstly, Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, holds blades at a perfect 30-degree angle, extending the blade just 0.0013 inches past the shave plane. That's less than the thickness of a human hair, which keeps the blade supported properly, unlike many other companies' blades, and ensures a better protection for your skin. Secondly, they're just cheaper. Those fancy blade cartridges are full of single-use junk, which makes each individual blade way more expensive than what you actually need. Henson's razor just takes totally standard blades that cost just a few cents, which means you can save money and can refresh your blades more often, so you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face to try and get value out of that overpriced plastic. Finally, speaking of plastic, those cartridges aren't good for the environment either, with 2 billion razor cartridges thrown away every year in the US alone. That's not true of Henson's blades, which contain 0 plastic, even in their packaging. If you want to try it out, go to hensonshaving.com/TLDR, or click the link in the description. Then add a razor and 100 blades to your cart. Once you've done that, add our discount code TLDR at checkout, and you'll get all of those blades totally free.